The rain had been falling for 3 hours when Sable Voss found the man unconscious in the doorway of her shop. But that is not where this story truly begins. It begins 6 weeks earlier, in the moment she realized she possessed something that could either save him or destroy them both. And that Lord Aldrich Cavendish? No. Those names belong to other stories. This man's name was Lord Corvin Drayle, and he was not, in any ordinary sense of the word, a man at all. She was holding a needle when they came for her. Not a weapon. She was not the sort of woman who thought in those terms, but the long silver kind she used for heavy wool, and she had it threaded with black because she had been in the middle of repairing the lining of a coat. His coat, as it happened. The coat that had started everything. The man who had sent his associate to collect her. A thin, cold-eyed person who introduced himself as Mr. Aldous Frey, stood in the doorway of her workroom and told her, in a voice like gravel pressed flat, that she would come with him now, or her friend Bertrice would find herself evicted from the lodgings she had occupied for 11 years. "You cannot do that," Ottilie said. She kept the needle in her hand, not as a threat. She simply forgot to put it down, because her mind was already moving fast, cataloguing, measuring. "Lord Vantnor can do a great many things," Frey said. "He owns the building." She looked at the coat on her workbench. She looked at the needle. She thought of Corvin Drayle's face the first time she had seen it, not tonight, not this version of events. But 7 years ago, in a different city, in a different rain. Then she set the needle down, picked up her shawl, and went with Frey into the dark. 3 months earlier, everything had been simpler. Or at least it had seemed so. Ottilie Marsh was 31 years old, the daughter of a tailor who had died owing money to 4 separate creditors, and she had inherited his shop, his debts, and his talent in that order of usefulness. The talent was the only one she was grateful for. She worked out of a narrow building on Corvus Lane. She had always found the name a little ironic, given what came later, with a window that faced north because the light was more honest in that direction, and a door that stuck in damp weather, which in this particular English autumn meant it stuck approximately always. She was left-handed, which her father had considered a flaw, and she considered simply a fact. It meant she held her scissors differently, angled her work at a slight tilt, and finished hems with a particular slant that her regular customers had come to recognize. Mrs. Alderton. No, that name is taken too. Mrs. Penhall, who brought her curtains every spring, had once said that you could always tell an Ottilie Marsh hem from the inside of the fabric, where the stitches were just a fraction more deliberate than they needed to be. Ottilie had taken this as a compliment, though she suspected it had not entirely been meant as one. She had no family left. She had Bertrice, who was 45 and sold dried flowers from a cart 2 streets over and had the laugh of a woman twice her size. She had her left hand and her needles and the particular satisfaction of making something broken whole again. That was sufficient. She had told herself this so many times that she had almost stopped noticing when it felt insufficient. The night Lord Corvin Drayle walked back into her life, it was raining. She had closed the shop an hour before, but she was still at her workbench. She was always still at her workbench, when she heard the sound at the door. Not a knock, more of a weight settling against it, the way a door sounds when something leans rather than strikes. She set down the collar she had been turning and listened. The sound came again, then silence. Ottilie was not by nature a cautious woman. She was a practical one, which is different. A cautious woman would have remained at her bench. A practical woman picked up her lamp and went to see what was making the noise, because, if it was a stray dog, it would need to be moved before it made a nuisance of itself, and if it was a person they might need help. She opened the door and found a man on her step. He was tall. She registered that even before she registered anything else, because tall men do not fold themselves small gracefully, and this one had made a poor attempt of it, his long legs at an angle, one shoulder against the doorframe, his coat soaked through in a way that told her it had been wet for longer than this evening's rain could account for. His face was turned away from her lamp. "I beg your pardon," she said, which was perhaps an odd thing to say to an unconscious man, but Ottilie's manners were automatic. He was not, it turned out, entirely unconscious. He stirred at her voice, and when he turned his face toward the lamp, she saw him. 7 years dissolved like salt in warm water. He looked exactly the same. That was the first thing. Not similar. Exactly. The same planes of his face, the same quality of stillness around the eyes, the same dark hair that fell forward when he moved his head. She had been 24 the first time she saw him, in Bruges, where she had gone to apprentice with a Flemish lacemaker for a season, and had instead spent most of her time lost. He had given her directions. That was all. He had been standing outside a church in the rain. She noticed now, with a distant amusement, that it had been raining then too, and he had told her where the lacemaker's house was, and she had thanked him, and he had looked at her with those dark eyes and said very quietly, "You are welcome, Miss Marsh." And she had walked half a block before realizing she had never told him her name. She had thought about that for 7 years, not obsessively, but it had lived in the back of her mind the way a particular piece of music lives there, surfacing sometimes when she was tired or when the work was slow. "Lord Drayle," she said, his eyes focused on her. Something moved through his expression, recognition, and then, beneath it, something she could not immediately name, not quite relief. Something older than relief. "Miss Marsh," he said. His voice was the same, too. "I am afraid I require assistance." She looked at him, at the coat, good wool once, now ruined, at the pallor of his face, which was extreme even accounting for the cold, at the way he held himself, as though the effort of remaining upright was considerable. "Come inside," she said. "You are getting my step wet." This was not, she knew, the most gracious invitation ever extended, but he almost smiled at it, and she thought that was probably the right response. She brought him in and sat him in the chair she kept for customers, the good one with the padded arms, and she lit 2 more lamps because the pallor of his face alarmed her in a way she was not yet ready to examine. She brought him water, which he accepted but did not drink. She noticed this. She noticed also that when she had helped him from the doorstep to the chair, he had needed the help, which told her a great deal. His hand on her arm had been cold in a way that was not simply weather. Cold in the way that marble is cold, not affected by temperature but simply, constitutionally, without heat. "You should explain yourself," she said, settling onto her work stool. "You owe me that, I think. You knew my name in Bruges. I have wondered about that for 7 years." He looked at her steadily. He had, she noticed, extraordinarily dark eyes. Not brown, but something richer, the color of old wood in low light. "I knew your name because I had heard of your father," he said. "He made a coat for a friend of mine many years ago. The friend spoke of his daughter who had inherited the talent." "That is a reasonable explanation," Ottilie said. "It does not explain why you are on my doorstep in November, looking as though you have not slept in a month." He was quiet for a moment, then, "I need your help, Miss Marsh, and I am aware that I have no right to ask it." "Tell me what you need," she said. "Then I will decide whether you have the right." He told her some of it that night. Not all, she would understand later, that he was measuring what she could absorb, which was both considerate and slightly condescending, and she would tell him so. But that first night he told her that he was in London without resources, that he had been— the word he used was displaced, and she filed away the careful vagueness of it, from his estate in the north, and that he had a particular problem that required a particular kind of assistance. "My coat," he said. She looked at it. She had been looking at it since he sat down, professionally and otherwise. It was a remarkable garment, or had been. Heavy black wool, cut in a style that was perhaps 10 years out of fashion, with a lining of deep burgundy silk that was coming apart at the seams in a very specific way. The seams had been repaired before, she could see the old stitching, but the thread used had been wrong. Silver thread, which was odd, because silver thread was decorative, not structural. It had held for a while and then failed. The lining, she said. Yes. Someone used silver thread to repair it. He met her eyes. Yes. That was foolish, she said. Silver is too fine for structural work. It looks well, but it does not hold. She paused. Why does the lining matter so much? It is not visible from the outside. The silence that followed was the longest of the evening. He looked at his hands, which were folded in his lap, with the careful stillness of someone who has learned to manage their own stillness very deliberately. Then he looked up at her. The coat was made by your father, he said, with certain materials, at the request of the friend I mentioned. Your father was a remarkable craftsman, Miss Marsh. He understood that certain garments serve purposes beyond the decorative. She thought about this. She thought about the chest her father had kept locked, which she had opened after his death and found full of correspondence she had never entirely understood. Letters from men with old names, references to materials she had had to look up, bills for things like pressed rowan flowers and iron filings worked into batting. She had assumed it was eccentricity. Her father had been an eccentric man. You are telling me, she said slowly, that the coat is not simply a coat. I am telling you, he said, that the coat was made to protect its wearer, and that the protection has been failing since the lining was improperly repaired, and that I have not been able to find anyone else who understands how to correct it. Because my father is dead, she said. Yes. He looked at her with those old wood eyes. And because the skill was his. But I believe it may also be yours. Ottilie sat with this for a long moment. Outside, the rain continued its patient accumulation against the window. The lamps made the room small and warm. She looked at the coat, and then at the man, and then at her own left hand, which was resting on her knee with the unconscious readiness of a hand that is always prepared to work. I will look at it, she said. I am not promising anything else. That is more than I expected, he said, and she thought she heard beneath the formality something genuine and worn. She examined the coat the next morning, in proper daylight, with her father's old chest open beside her on the workbench. She had brought it up from the cellar the night before, after Corvin Drayle had left. He had a room, he said, at a modest establishment nearby, which told her something about the degree of his current displacement, and she had sat with it for an hour before she could bring herself to open it properly. The letters made more sense now. Her father had written in his cramped, precise hand about the properties of various materials, iron as a stabilizer, rowan as a purifier, certain dyes that could be worked into thread to produce effects that were not, strictly speaking, chemical. He had written about clients who were not what they appeared. He had written, once, about a coat he had made for a lord in the north, with a lining constructed to shield the wearer from the particular vulnerabilities of his condition. His condition. Her father had been a practical man, too. She spread the coat on her workbench and examined the lining with her loupe. The original stitching was her father's. She recognized it immediately, the particular angle of the left-handed seamstress that had apparently been hereditary. The repair stitching was someone else's, and it had been done with silver thread throughout, which had seemed, she supposed, appropriate to someone who did not understand the actual purpose of the garment. Silver was associated with protection, in the common understanding, but her father's notes were clear. Silver was reactive. It interfered. For a wearer of Lord Drayle's particular nature, silver in the lining was not protection, but a slow, persistent irritant, like a stone in a shoe that could not be removed. She understood then why he looked as he did, why the pallor was not weather but something deeper, why he held himself with such careful economy of movement. She sat back on her stool and thought about what she had. She had knowledge. Specific, rare, irreplaceable knowledge of how to repair the one garment that stood between Corvin Drayle and a vulnerability he could not otherwise address. She had her father's materials, which were still in the chest. She had the skill. He needed all of it. He had nothing to offer in return. Or so he had implied. But she had spent 31 years watching people imply they had nothing to offer when in fact they simply assumed they would not be asked. She picked up her pen and wrote him a note, which she sent to his lodgings by way of the boy who ran errands for the cobbler next door. He came that afternoon. "I will repair the coat," she said, before he had fully settled into the customer's chair. "I know what your father's friend commissioned, and I know what the coat is meant to do. I have the materials and the knowledge." He looked at her with an expression she was beginning to recognize, the one where he was deciding how much she knew and recalibrating accordingly. "Miss Marsh, I am not finished," she said. "I will repair it, and in exchange you will do three things. First, you will settle my father's outstanding debt to the merchant Hollis, which has been accruing interest for 4 years, and which I cannot clear on my own. Second, you will tell me the truth about what you are, because I believe I know and I would prefer confirmation to supposition. Third, you will explain why you disappeared from Bruges 7 years ago, without giving me the chance to ask you how you knew my name." The silence was considerable. He looked at her hands, which were folded in her lap in a deliberate mirror of his own stillness. Then he looked at her face. "Those are significant terms," he said. "It is a significant coat," she said. Something changed in his expression, not softening exactly, but a kind of settling, as though something that had been held taut had been permitted to ease slightly. "The debt to Hollis," he said. "That I can arrange. I have resources, though fewer than I once had. The truth? Yes. You deserve the truth, and I think you already know most of it." He paused. "Bruges is more complicated." "Begin with the truth," she said. "We can work up to complicated." He told her. Not all at once. It took the better part of that afternoon and the following morning, with Ottilie asking questions in her direct, practical way, and Corvin answering them with the careful precision of a man who had kept secrets for so long that honesty felt like a new and slightly dangerous language. He was what she had suspected. He had been what he was for a very long time. He did not tell her exactly how long, and she did not press, because she could see that the number was one he found difficult to say aloud. He was not dangerous to her. He had not been dangerous to anyone in a very long time. He sustained himself on what he called the old arrangements, which she understood to mean willing donors from among those who knew his nature, and which he spoke of with a matter-of-factness that she found oddly more reassuring than anything more dramatic would have been. The coat, he explained, had been his primary protection against the particular weakness that silver and sustained vulnerability imposed. Without it, he was diminished, not destroyed, but reduced to something less than what he needed to be to manage his own affairs. The wrong repair had been made 2 years ago, by someone who had meant well and understood nothing. Since then, he had been declining in a slow, grinding way that had cost him his estate, his position in the particular society to which he belonged, and most of his resources. He had come to London because London was where her father had worked, and her father was dead, and she was the only remaining possibility. "Bruges," she said when he had finished. It was the following morning, and she had made tea, which he accepted and did not drink, and she had stopped noticing this. "You knew my name before you had any reason to. You said it was because of my father, but my father was alive then. You could have gone to him directly." He looked at his tea, then at her. "I had heard of you specifically," he said, "not only as your father's daughter. I had heard that you had a particular quality, that you saw things accurately, that you were not easily deceived." He paused. "I was curious. I went to Bruges to see for myself." And? "And I saw for myself," he said. "And then I left, because I had no right to involve you in my world when you had your own life to live." Ottilie considered this. "That was presumptuous," she said finally, "deciding for me what I could manage." "Yes," he said. He did not argue the point. She began work on the coat that afternoon. It was painstaking work. She had to remove the silver thread entirely, which meant taking apart the lining seam by seam, and then restitching with the materials her father had specified. Iron-infused thread of a particular weight, a batting layer that incorporated pressed rowan and certain mineral compounds that her father had sourced from a specific supplier in Edinburgh and that she would need to find an equivalent for. She sent letters, she ordered materials. She worked in the evenings after the regular customers had gone, with the lamps turned high and her father's notes propped open on the shelf above the bench. Corvin came each afternoon. He did not hover. She would not have tolerated hovering. But he sat in the customer's chair, and they talked. This was, she realized, the complication she had not anticipated. She had anticipated the work, and the truth, and the debt. She had not anticipated that he would be interesting to talk to in the specific way that made time move differently. He had been alive for longer than any institution she could name. He had opinions about the Reform Act that were based on personal observation. He had read everything, including things she had not known existed, and he asked her questions about her work with a genuine attention that she found both flattering and slightly unnerving because she was not accustomed to being attended to. He noticed that she was left-handed and asked about it. He noticed that she kept a particular book, a collection of Flemish textile patterns, open on the shelf not for reference, but because she liked looking at it. And he asked about that too. She noticed things about him in return, that he was, beneath the careful formality, lonely in a way that had gone on long enough to become structural, like a crack in a wall that has been there so long the wall has built itself around it. That he laughed rarely but genuinely, a short, surprised sound, as though laughter still caught him off guard. That he watched her hands when she worked with an expression she could not read, but that did not make her uncomfortable. She did not give him the coat before it was finished. She was clear about this. The terms of their arrangement were the terms: debt settled, truth told, and the coat upon completion. She was not going to hand over her advantage before she had received what she had asked for. The debt to Hollis was settled in the second week. She received confirmation by letter, and she read it twice, and then she folded it and put it in her father's chest, which seemed the right place for it. Bertrice noticed the change in her. "You are distracted," Bertrice said. She had come to the shop on a Thursday afternoon with a basket of dried lavender and the expression she wore when she had decided to be direct. "You are working long hours, but you do not seem tired. You have been answering questions I have not asked." "I have a significant commission," Ottilie said. "The man who comes every afternoon is not a commission," Bertrice said. "He is something else." Ottilie looked at her friend. Bertrice had known her for 9 years. There was very little point in deflection. "He is complicated," Ottilie said. "They always are," Bertrice said, and left the lavender on the bench and did not press further, because that was what made her a good friend. It was Bertrice, as it happened, who first noticed Lord Vantnor. She mentioned him a week later, a man who had been asking questions in the neighborhood, about the shop, about Ottilie specifically, about what kind of work she did and who her clients were. He had asked Bertrice's flower cart neighbor, and the woman who ran the lending library 2 streets over, and the cobbler's boy who ran errands. He had asked with the careful indirection of someone who did not want it known that he was asking. "What does he look like?" Ottilie asked. "Thin," Bertrice said. "Cold-looking, well-dressed, but in the way that makes you think of the dressing rather than the man." Ottilie thought about this. That evening, when Corvin came, she told him. His expression did not change dramatically, but she had learned to read the smaller signals, the way his hands stilled further than their usual stillness, the slight adjustment in the set of his shoulders. "Lord Vantnor," he said. "You know him." "He is the reason I was displaced from my estate," Corvin said. He paused. "He is what I am. Or rather, he is what I am, and has chosen a different relationship with that fact. He believes that my current vulnerability represents an opportunity." "An opportunity for what?" "To absorb what remains of my resources and position into his own." He looked at her steadily. "He knows about the coat. He knows it requires repair. He does not know that you are repairing it, or he did not until recently, it seems." Ottilie thought about the terms of their arrangement. She thought about the coat, which was perhaps a week from completion. She thought about Bertrice, who had 11 years in her lodgings and who had mentioned Vantner's questions with the careful casualness of someone who was not quite sure whether to be worried. "He owns Bertrice's building," she said. It was not a question. She had made the connection quickly. "I believe so," Corvin said. "I am sorry. I did not anticipate that he would identify you so quickly." "What does he want from me specifically?" "The coat," Corvin said, "and the knowledge of how to make another. If he can replicate the protection for himself and deny it to me, or if he can simply take the coat before it is completed and return to me, he eliminates the possibility of my recovery." Ottilie looked at the coat on her workbench. It was perhaps 70% complete. The new lining was in, the iron-infused thread was holding beautifully, and she had sourced the mineral compounds from a supplier in York who had not asked questions. The Rowan batting was finished. What remained was the final seaming, the outer repairs, and the particular finishing stitch her father had used along the collar that she had spent 3 evenings learning from his notes. "He cannot replicate it without me," she said slowly, "or without someone like me." "No," Corvin said. "The knowledge is specific, and he knows it." "Then I have something he wants," she said, "and so do you." "Yes. That is useful," she said. "Sit down. I need to think." She thought for the better part of an hour, while Corvin sat in the customer's chair and did not interrupt her, which she appreciated. She thought about leverage, and about timing, and about what Vantner knew versus what he could prove. She thought about Bertrice and the lodgings. She thought about the coat. "I need 3 more days to finish it," she said finally. "Can you ensure that nothing happens to this shop or to Bertrice in 3 days?" "I can try," he said. "My resources are limited." "That is not reassuring," she said. "No," he agreed. "It is not." She worked through the next 2 nights. She did not tell Bertrice the full situation. She told her enough to ensure that Bertrice stayed with her sister in Islington for a few days, which Bertrice accepted with the grace of a woman who understood that some explanations came later. The shop felt quieter, without the possibility of Bertrice's laugh from the street. On the 3rd morning, Aldous Frey came to the door. He was exactly as Bertrice had described, thin, cold-eyed, well-dressed, in the way that prioritized impression over comfort. He stood in the doorway of the workroom and told her about Bertrice's lodgings, and Ottilie stood with the silver needle in her hand and thought very quickly. The coat was on the workbench. It was finished. She had completed the collar stitch at 2 in the morning, and it was, she thought, the best work she had ever done. Her father would have recognized it. She had not yet sent word to Corvin. Frey had not yet seen the coat. He was looking at her. She set the needle down. She picked up her shawl. She went with him, because the calculation was clear. She had something Vantner wanted, and that meant she had a negotiation, not a surrender. She was not afraid. She was, if anything, very focused. Lord Vantner's London establishment was in Mayfair, which told her something about the nature of his resources. She was brought to a sitting room that was furnished with the aggressive confidence of someone who wanted visitors to feel small. She sat in the chair she was directed to and looked at Vantner when he entered and thought, "He is not as frightening as he has arranged things to suggest." He was perhaps 50 in appearance, which she now understood to mean nothing about his actual age. He was handsome in a way that had clearly once been considerable, and had since curdled slightly into something that was more about authority than beauty. He looked at her with the assessing attention of someone who was accustomed to people being unnerved by it. She looked back at him with the direct, level gaze she used when examining fabric for flaws. "Miss Marsh," he said, "I understand you have been doing some rather specialized work." "I am a seamstress," she said. "I do a great deal of specialized work." "For Lord Drayle specifically?" "I have many clients," she said. "I do not discuss one client's commissions with another." He smiled. It was the smile of someone who had decided that pleasantries had served their purpose. "I will be direct," he said. The coat you are repairing belongs, by rights, to me. Drail's estate and its contents were transferred as part of a legal arrangement that he failed to honor. The coat is among those contents. This was, she suspected, not entirely true, but she also suspected that the legal arrangement existed and that it was complicated enough to be weaponized. I see, she said. I would like you to complete the coat, Vantner said, for me, and to provide me with your father's methodology so that the work can be continued by someone in my employ. And in exchange? Your friend's lodgings remain intact. Your shop's lease, which I have also recently acquired, remains favorable, and I will pay you a sum considerably larger than whatever Drail has promised. Ottilie looked at her hands, then at Vantner. The coat is not complete, she said. This was a lie, but a useful one, and she told it with the tranquility of a woman who is very good at keeping her expression from doing anything she has not decided it should do. It requires at least another week. That is unfortunate, Vantner said, but acceptable. You will work here, under— No, she said. He paused. I work in my own shop, she said, with my own materials. I cannot produce the quality you require under other conditions. The work is too precise. If you want it done correctly, it must be done in my workroom. She paused. And I require my father's chest, which contains materials that cannot be sourced elsewhere on short notice. The chest was in her workroom. The coat was in her workroom. She needed to get back to her workroom. Vantner looked at her for a long moment. She did not look away. She thought about the needles she had left on the workbench, and about the collar stitch she had finished at 2 a.m, and about Corvin Drail sitting in the customer's chair, asking her questions about Flemish textile patterns. Frey will accompany you, Vantner said, and remain. Of course, she said, I understand the terms. The terms were clear enough. She was permitted to return to her shop, but she was not free. Frey would be there. Vantner expected the coat. She had perhaps a few hours before he expected progress. She had, in fact, a finished coat and a plan that was forming as Frey walked her back through the Mayfair streets in the November cold. The plan relied on one thing she was not certain of, whether Corvin had received her note. She had written it before Frey arrived. She had heard the sound at the door and had a full minute before she opened it, which she had used to write 4 lines and send them by way of the cobbler's boy, who was reliable and fast. Whether the boy had reached Corvin's lodgings before Frey took her was a question she could not answer. She had to proceed as though the answer was yes. Back in her workroom, with Frey stationed by the door in a way that was meant to be intimidating and was merely inconvenient, Ottilie went to her workbench. The coat was there. She had covered it with a length of plain linen, which she did not remove. She opened her father's chest and took out several items with the purposeful air of someone beginning a project. And she set them on the bench. And she picked up her needle, the long silver one, which she now held differently, with intention, and she threaded it. What are you doing? Frey said. Beginning the work, she said. It takes time to prepare. Please do not speak to me while I am threading. I lose count. He subsided. She worked. She was not, in fact, working on the coat. She was doing nothing of significance at the bench. But she was thinking very hard, and thinking, for Ottilie Marsh, had always looked from the outside like work. Corvin came through the back. She had not known there was a back entrance. She had lived in this building for 4 years and had assumed the rear door was permanently sealed because it had not opened in her memory. It opened now, with a sound like a long breath being released, and Corvin was there, and he was not alone. With him was an older woman, older in appearance, which Ottilie now knew meant little, with white hair and the bearing of someone who had spent centuries deciding that posture was worth maintaining. She was introduced later as Madame Sorrel. She was, Corvin explained in a rapid undertone, a senior member of the particular society to which he belonged, and she had come because of the note, and because what Ottilie had described in 4 lines was enough to constitute a formal complaint against Vantner under the laws of that society. Frey saw them and straightened. You are not permitted. I am permitted a great deal, Madame Sorrel said. Her voice was the kind that did not require volume. Considerably more than you, I suspect. Sit down. Frey sat down. It appeared to surprise him. Lord Vantnor has made certain claims, Ottilie said. She had turned from her workbench and was now standing with her arms folded and the long needle still in her hand, which she,